Hi, I'm Kate Cottle, and I'm here today to talk to you about effective MUGs, grammar instruction for basic writers. MUGs stands for Mechanics, Usage, and Grammar, and it's the acronym that we use to talk about all the conventions that we teach to students to help them write and speak better in college and in work. So before I talk about grammar, I need to talk about writing, and I want to talk about voice in writing, because it's one of the things that is the hardest for all writers to achieve. To make what's happening in your head also match what's happening on the paper is a big, big challenge for most people. I teach basic writing. I teach the levels below college writing. And so I don't see too much voice in people's writing yet. People are still developing. But a couple years ago, I was teaching the lower level English class, and the task that was set for the student was to write a narrative that told about one event and produced a change in their life or taught them a lesson. And this student, Jasmine, came back with a paper that was all over the place. It was 10 different events. It was run-on sentences. It was dialectical speech. And at the same time, I could really, really hear her voice. This is one of the sentences from that first paper. And if you read it in your head, you can really hear a writer's voice. And so I looked at this student and I thought, wow, she's really smart. And as I kept working with her, I thought, wow, she's really, really smart. But I also had this sinking feeling because I knew that there would be a lot of teachers who would hear the dialect and not see the intelligence. Because in America, we judge people by dialectical speech. We judge them morally, intellectually, in all ways, like their potential for success. And so people who speak dialectically are judged as less, even though dialectical speech is not a marker of any of these things. So, before I can talk to you about all this grammar, I have to talk to you about like big picture grammar. So descriptive grammar is where you say, this is what's happening in people's speech or in their writing. There's no judgment attached. It's just looking at the bits and pieces, how they're being put together, and then what meaning it's being created. And so descriptive grammar is really, really big. And prescriptive grammar is actually what we are thinking of when we think of grammar. And that it's more like linguistic etiquette. It's a bunch of rules that we kind of agreed to as a standard, but they're not really the standard that we think they are. So prescriptive grammar is super, super necessary in almost everybody's education. Because if people don't have access to standard English, maybe through prescriptive grammar, they have several disadvantages. It's going to be harder for them to learn. It's going to be harder for them to retain the learning. It's going to be harder for them to persist through difficult tasks. If they don't have standard English, then the conventions of academic English feel like a hidden code. And so people need to have prescriptive grammar. But at the same time, prescriptive grammar is limiting, because if we're calling one thing a standard, we're calling everything else a non-standard. You know, standard English and non-standard English. And it's just not true, because dialectical English and dialect of any language anywhere is internally complex and has rules just like standard English. So standard English is in fact another dialect. It's just that it's positioned very centrally as a language of wider communication. So, oh wait, I forgot to tell you the thing about prescriptive grammar that's the worst. The thing that's the worst is that people don't learn. If you're teaching people grammar in order to improve their writing, we're not doing what we're supposed to do, because people's writing is not improving with traditional grammar studies. So there are ways to teach grammar that actually have data support behind them and work. And the first one is sentence combining. This is a really, I don't want to say really old method, because it's been around only since the 1960s, but it has a lot of data behind it. And it's really ideal for a lot of different situations, because the instructor doesn't have to use much meta language, much grammar terminology. Students are asked to take kernel sentences and combine them either with cued conjunctions or without cues. A second way of teaching grammar that really works for students is sentence creation, and this is where students are asked to write sentences to specific prompts, like write a compound sentence with 2 infinitives in it. And it's a twofer, because students are writing, but they're also having to learn how to write through the grammatic structures, so they learn the grammatic structures. Another one is sentence revision and transformation, and this is where students are asked to revise their own writing in response to specific linguistic prompts, and often these are dialectical. But in being asked to look for these linguistic markers, students are able to match their writing to conventional writing, or conventional English. And then there's grammar and context. And this is an interesting one because there's not a lot of data on it. There's surprisingly less data than one might think, considering that it's in almost every classroom in America. I don't know any English teacher who doesn't first look at what the needs of the student are before saying what the grammatic lessons need to happen. So that's a part of that too, responsive to what students need. So we also used writing pedagogy, self-regulated strategies instruction. We echoed the same kind of curricular patterns that are in that, especially guided instruction. And this is where the teacher says it first, and then the teacher and the class do it together, and then the students do it by themselves. And so they've had 2 exposures to it before they try it on their own. And then the last kind of tool that we incorporated into this in terms of practices was bring your own device. So part of this is students do sentence combining and then they put it into a Google Doc so we can all work with it together, but they're using their iPad or their tablets or their laptops to put it into the Google Docs. One of the most important things that this curriculum did was reposition standard English. We talk about standard English as not a standard. We talk about it as a dialect that is going to be necessary for school and for work, but it is not more or less than anybody's home language. And then we gave them one more tool. And this last tool is called the Sentence Analysis Strategy Sheet. And there are lots of tips and tricks all over this to help students identify what's happening in their sentences, but one of the most central things that we asked of students was to be able to identify their subjects and verbs. Because if they can identify their subjects and verbs, they can identify their clause structures. So students would be given this sheet and then they'd be asked to identify subjects and verbs, and in doing that, Jasmine hopefully would have been able to look at her own writing and go, okay, I can see the subjects and verbs here, but this is a misspelling. See where the where is, and see that it needs to be we are. And in doing so, see where the clause structure needs to sit, where the punctuation needs to happen, and all of that. So that was the hope. So we ran this grammar curriculum in the fall in 2 classes, and at the end of the semester, I collected homework, I collected essays, I collected a pre-test and a post-test. I was able to interview some students and do a cognitive lab with some students. And these are the results. They still made a lot of mistakes. A lot. But it's okay. So in the pre-test, students were making, this is the red bar on the left, we're making 1.7 errors per sentence. In the post-test, which is at the end of the semester, they were still making a lot of errors per sentence, 1.43. But this is a timed writing situation where students didn't have a lot of time for revision. But in the last paper that they wrote for the class where they did have time for a revision, the number of errors went down to 0.92 per sentence. The pink bar represents how many correct sentences as a percentage of the total sentences in the essay. And so in the pretest, students only had 0.16 of their sentences without errors. By the time they hit the post-test, 0.34. And again, this is a timed writing situation, so they didn't have time to really take careful looks. But when they did have time to take a careful look, the number of correct sentences went up to 0.44. So, progress, but not enough. The other data that I've finished analyzing is the interview data. And the 2 main takeaways from the interview data is that students loved using their cell phones in class. They loved being told to take it out and use it as a part of this. And it helped reduce some of their stress and some of their resistance to the grammar curriculum. And the other thing that students really loved was the guided instruction. Because one of the things about grammar, like writing, is that people get a little anxious. And so the fact that I was showing them what to do, we were all doing it together, and then when it came time for their independent practice, we did it as a think, pair, share, and so they had another level of anxiety that got reduced, and they really, really enjoyed it. So, not all the data analysis is finished. I have to, keep working. But what I know now about what I want to change for next time is I want to scaffold this out farther. I don't want it to just be in basic writing. I want it to go in the level below and the 2 classes above, so that by the time students are finished with their whole round of English classes, hopefully they're writing it, something like 90% correct, 95, something. And the other thing that I know I need to do is in the sentence analysis strategy sheet, I need to do more work with verbs and give students more information about how to spot verbs, because that's one of the biggest things that they're having trouble with, is spotting subjects and verbs. So, you know, we're going to keep fighting the good fight, and if it's not a good fight, at least it's a grammatically correct and syntactically correct one. Thank you.